The sea was breathing tonight, long, slow breaths that rolled in from the endless black beyond, curling against the jagged rocks, then sighing away again, leaving the stones glistening under the dim wash of the moon. The sky was heavy with clouds, but here and there the wind tore a small hole, letting down pale beams of light, like ghostly fingers brushing the dark water. Somewhere out there the sound of a bell buoy rang, a hollow, distant note, swaying with the unseen swell. It had been ringing all evening, steady, patient, like the pulse of the night itself. On the cliff above, the old lighthouse of Gull's Hollow stood, its white stone walls streaked with age and salt, its lantern turning in slow, steady revolutions. The beam swept across the ocean, catching the silver flash of a wave, then vanishing. Again into the dark. It had been there for more than a century, guarding this treacherous stretch of coast. They said its keeper, long ago, had vanished in the middle of a storm, leaving the light still turning and the door still locked from the inside. No one ever found him, only his boots by the threshold, wet with rain and spray. The story was old, repeated in whispers in the village, but never quite forgotten. And tonight the air carried something that made people glance toward the cliffs and quicken their steps home. Down in the village of Gull's Hollow itself, lamps glowed warmly in the windows of weather-beaten houses. The streets were narrow, winding between buildings with cedar shingles faded to silver gray. The scent of the tide mixed with the faint aroma of wood smoke drifting from chimneys. Somewhere a dog barked once, then fell silent. Inside the small inn on Main Street, a few fishermen sat nursing mugs of coffee, their oilskin jackets dripping rainwater onto the floor. The conversation was low, not because there was nothing to say, but because the sea had a way of swallowing words and weather like this. At the far end of the counter, a stranger sat, his back to the wall, a travel bag at his feet. He wasn't, from here anyone could tell. His coat was thick but too new, without the smell of years of salt in the fibers. His eyes kept drifting toward the window, as though he expected to see something beyond the glass, beyond the street, out toward the black shape of the cliff. The innkeeper, a wiry man with weathered hands, poured him a refill. "Yeah, not? Heading out tonight, are you?" he asked, his voice a quiet mix of curiosity and caution. The stranger shook his head. "No, not yet, just listening." The innkeeper studied him for a moment longer, then moved away, not pressing. But the fishermen exchanged glances. Around here, listening usually meant something else. The wind shifted outside, rattling the old wooden sign that swung over the inn's doorway. The bell on it clanged once, sharp and metallic, a sound that seemed to echo faintly, too faintly, somewhere out toward the lighthouse. The stranger's eyes followed that sound. In the far corner, an older woman wearing a knitted shawl leaned toward him. "If you're staying the night," she said, "stay inside. The hollow's no place for wandering after dark." "Not when the tide's turning." He met her gaze. "What happens when the tide turns?" She gave a small, humorless smile. things. Come back. The door swung open then, letting in a rush of cold, damp air. A man stepped inside, his face lined and wind-burned, his boots heavy with water. He set a basket of fish on the counter, nodded to the room, and made his way to the stove to warm his hands. Nobody spoke for a while. The stranger finished his coffee, stood, and reached for his bag. "Which way to the lighthouse?" he asked. The room seemed to go still. One of the fishermen gave a short laugh, but it held no real amusement. "You don't go to the hollow at night," he said. "You wait for morning." The stranger didn't answer. He paid, thanked the innkeeper, and stepped out into the street. The wind caught at his coat immediately, pushing cold through the seams. Rain was falling now, not in sheets, but in thin, slanted needles, each drop sharp on his face. He turned toward the cliffs. The road narrowed to a path, winding upward between patches of wet grass and black, slick rock. The sound of the waves grew louder with each step, the crash and suck of water on stone, the hiss of foam pulling back, and above it all the slow, steady sweep of the lighthouse beam, cutting through the rain like a pale blade. Halfway up he paused. Something had moved at the edge of his vision, a figure, maybe, just beyond the bend in the path. But when he rounded it, there was nothing but the wet slope, the grass bending under the wind. At the top, the lighthouse loomed, its door shut tight, the walls beaded with rain. The beam turned, lighting the stones beneath his feet, then swung away. He reached for the door. It was unlocked. Inside, the air was damp and cool, the sound of the rain soft to a murmur against the thick walls. The narrow stair curled upward, each step worn to a shallow dip in the middle. He climbed, hand trailing along the stone, until he reached the lantern room. The great lamp turned slowly, the mechanism clicking faintly with each rotation. Through the glass he could see the ocean spread wide and black, the faint shapes of waves far below. He stood there a long moment, breathing in the salt and oil smell of the place. Then faintly, under the wind and the turning lamp, he heard it. A knock from downstairs. He froze. The knock came again, soft but clear, 3 times. He turned, listening, but the stairwell was empty. The door at the bottom had been closed, hadn't it? The beam swept past, and in the brief shadow between its revolutions, the room seemed darker, heavier, as if the walls themselves were leaning closer. Another knock. This one against the door to the lantern room itself. He moved toward it slowly, every step echoing too loudly. When he opened it, the stairwell was still empty, but water was running down the steps, trickling from somewhere above him. That made no sense. The rain was outside below the lantern glass. He looked up, and that was when he saw the boot. Just one, lying on the stone near the top of the stairs. Old leather, dark with water, and beside it another, smaller knock, closer, behind him. The boot lay there as though it had been set down carefully, not dropped. Its leather was cracked, the sole worn thin, the laces frayed and stiff. The stranger crouched, touching it with one fingertip. It was cold, colder than the damp stone. Beneath it and slick was something that wasn't just rainwater. It smelled faintly of brine, but not the clean tang of the sea. This was heavier, like the deep, still water in a place where sunlight never reached. He straightened slowly, scanning the lantern room. The beam made its steady turn, each revolution leaving him for a moment in shadow. That was when he thought he saw, through the glass on the far side of the lantern, a shape moving on the catwalk. Outside just a flicker, like someone passing in the corner of his vision. He stepped closer, peering out, but the wind was the only thing moving there, tugging at the iron rail, scattering droplets from the wet glass. He told himself it was nothing. The stories in the inn, the weather, the strange quiet, it was enough to make anyone think they saw something. Yet, when he turned back toward the stairs, the boot was gone. He froze, the muscles in his shoulders tightening. The step where it had rested was bare, only a faint wet print remaining, already fading into the stone. He took one step down. "Lee?" Sound came again, not a knock this time, but a slow scrape, as though something were being dragged across the floor below. He descended, the narrow stair bending out of sight ahead of him. Halfway down he stopped. There was water pooling on one of the steps, small ripples trembling across its surface, as though something had disturbed it moments before. He touched the wall. It was damp all the way up here, the moisture seeping from somewhere it shouldn't. At the base of the stairs, the heavy wooden door to the outside stood ajar. Wind pressed it inward, making it swing gently, the hinges groaning. Beyond it, the rain had thickened, the night darker than before, though the lighthouse beam still swept its slow path across the cliffs. He stepped outside. The cold hit him. Hard, a sudden weight in his chest, and the smell of the sea was sharper now. He could hear the bell buoy again, closer somehow, though the tide was coming in. He glanced toward the village. The lights in the windows seemed farther away than they had before, their glow dimmed, as though the fog had thickened between here and there. But there was no fog, only rain and darkness. The stranger turned toward the cliff's edge. The path sloped downward toward the rocks, where the waves were breaking white against the black stone. The beam of the lighthouse swung over them, showing slick patches of seaweed and water rushing into narrow channels. He thought he saw movement there, figures, maybe, just beyond the edge of the rocks, but the beam passed, and they were gone. A shout carried up from below, sudden and sharp, cutting through the sound of the waves. He froze, listening. It came again, hoarse, desperate, then was swallowed by the crash of water. He found himself moving down the slope before he decided to. The path was slick, and more than once he caught himself on the rocks to keep from falling. The shout came again, but fainter now. It sounded like a man's voice, though the words were lost in the wind. Near the bottom he saw it, a dark shape lying across the rocks, half in the water. The tide was rising fast, each wave pulling at it. He ran the last few yards, boots splashing through the pools left by the retreating water. It was a man dressed in old oilskins, the kind worn decades ago. His face was pale, his hair plastered to his skull, his eyes closed. The stranger knelt, shaking his shoulder. The man coughed suddenly, a spray of salt water leaving his lips. His eyes flew open, and for a moment they were wide, wild, as though he didn't know where he was. Then they fixed on the stranger, and his grip clamped hard around the stranger's wrist. "Not the light," he rasped. His voice was raw, torn by the sea and the wind. "Don't follow the light." The stranger started to ask what he meant, but another wave surged over the rocks, drenching them both. When it passed, the man was gone. The water where he had lain was empty. The only sign of him, the deep impression in the slick seaweed and a scattering of bubbles drifting upward. The stranger stood, shivering despite the coat coat, scanning the water. There was nothing there. The beam swept past again, lighting the spot for an instant before swinging away. Above him the lighthouse loomed, its lantern turning, steady. As ever, he climbed back toward it, each step heavier than the last. At the top, the door was still ajar. He stepped inside, closing it against the wind. The interior was quiet again, the sound of the sea muffled by the thick walls. He started toward the stairs and stopped. The boot was back, sitting neatly on the first step. This time there was a second beside it. Both were old, wet, their leather cracked, and between them a small puddle that reflected the lantern light in trembling silver shapes. Slowly he bent and picked one up. The water inside was ice cold. Something small shifted at the bottom, a shell, maybe, or a piece of smooth stone. He turned it over. A brass key slid out, clinking softly against the step. It was tarnished, green around the edges, and engraved with a single number, 0. He held it in his palm, the metal colder than the air, and for a moment the sound of the waves seemed to fade entirely, replaced by another sound, a slow, rhythmic tapping, far above him, like metal striking glass. He looked up the stairwell, but it was empty. The tapping continued, steady, measured. He pocketed the key and began to climb. The higher he went, the colder it became, as though he were ascending into some place apart from the rest of the night. The air smelled different here, less of salt and more of something metallic, almost like blood. At the top, the lantern room was lit as before, the great lamp turning, but the glass panes were beaded not with rain, but with condensation from inside. Each bead of water ran downward, leaving thin trails, as though something had pressed its face to the glass from within and breathed. Outside, the catwalk was empty. He stepped closer, wiping the condensation away with his sleeve. The sea stretched, black and endless, the village lights faint and far. The bell buoy rang again, though softer now, as if the sea were carrying it away. He turned back toward the stairs and froze. There was someone standing in the doorway, a man in oilskins, dripping with water, his face pale and still, eyes fixed on the stranger. In his hand he held a lantern, but its flame burned blue, casting strange, wavering shadows across the stone. "The tide's turning," the man said softly. Then, without another word, he stepped backward into the stairwell and was gone. The stranger stood there for a long time after the man in oilskins vanished, listening to the faint sound of dripping water in the stairwell, the quiet groan of the tower in the wind, the slow, steady pulse of the lantern as it turned. He moved to the doorway and looked down. The spiral of steps fell away into shadow, the faintest sheen of wetness glistening along the stone wall. He could still feel the chill where the man's blue lantern had burned in the air, as though its cold light had left an imprint on his skin. He descended carefully, one hand brushing the wall, his boots thudding softly on the worn stone treads. The key in his pocket felt heavy, as though it were dragging him downward. Halfway to the ground floor, he stopped again. There was a sound ahead, soft, irregular, like something moving, just out of sight. It might have been the wind under the door or the shuffle of a rat in the corner, but it was slower than that. Wet. He continued down each turn of the spiral, bringing the sound closer. At the bottom, the main door was closed now, bolted from the inside. That alone made his pulse quicken. He hadn't touched the bolt when he came in. The sound came again, this time from the side chamber off the entry hall. The door to that chamber stood half open, a strip of darkness visible beyond. He stepped toward it, his boots echoing faintly. The smell reached him before he crossed the threshold brine, but not fresh, the smell of water trapped in some deep, closed place for years. He pushed the door wider. It was a storage room, small, with shelves of rusted tools and coils of rope gone stiff with age. In one corner, a barrel lay on its side, the lid broken, a thin trickle of water running from it to pool on the stone floor. He knelt, touching the trickle. It was ice cold. When he drew his fingers back, there was grit on them, fine sand, the kind you'd find far below the tide line. He glanced into the barrel. It was empty, but the inside was slick, as though it had only just been drained. A faint metallic clink made him turn sharply. Something had fallen to the floor near the shelves, a brass coin, dark with tarnish. He picked it up. It was larger than a modern coin, stamped with an unfamiliar crest, a ship under full sail, a serpent twined around its mast. The date on it was worn nearly smooth, but he thought he could make out the digits 18 before they dissolved into corrosion. Another clink followed, but not from the shelves this time. It came from somewhere deeper beneath the floor. He crouched, listening. Yes, there it was again. A faint tap, 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 steady and deliberate. The sound of metal on stone. He looked around for a trapdoor, but the flagstones were solid, worn smooth by years of use. Still the tapping went on, slow, patient. He backed out of the room, closing the door, though the sound seemed to seep through anyway. In the main hall, he paused. The puddle between the boots on the stairs had grown larger, and he realized the water was flowing very slightly toward the storage room. He didn't like that. The key in his pocket felt heavier than before. He drew it out, holding it to the light. The engraving 0 caught the lantern's glow for a moment, then seemed to dull again, as if it didn't like the light. He climbed to the second level where the keeper's quarters were. The room was empty now, though the bed looked as if someone had risen from it only moments before, the blanket thrown back, the pillow indented. A faint dampness stained the sheets. On the small table beside the bed sat a closed law book, its leather cover warped by moisture. He sat and opened it. The handwriting was cramped and careful, each line pressed deep into the page. Most entries were unremarkable weather reports, ship sightings, notes about maintenance. But as he turned the pages, they began to change. Phrases appeared between the regular notes. Light behaving strangely tonight. Saw figures on the rocks. Could not reach them. Heard knocking from below. No one there. One page was smudged so badly he could barely read it, but he made out a line. The sea is inside now. He flipped further. The dates stopped abruptly in late autumn of an unspecified year. The final entry was short, "Do not answer the tide." The page after that was blank, though faint indentations suggested something had once been written there, then torn out. He was still staring at it when the tapping started again, only now it was upstairs. Slow, deliberate, metal on glass. He rose, heart thudding, and climbed toward the lantern room. The tapping stopped just before he reached the top. He stepped inside. The beam was still sweeping the sea, steady and strong. The glass was clear now, no condensation, but as he approached one of the panes, he saw faint marks on its small, circular smudges in a perfect line, like the outline of fingertips pressed against the inside. They trailed downward, ending at the frame where a single droplet of water hung, quivering, before it fell. He opened the door to the catwalk. The wind hit him hard, bringing with it the sound of the buoy bell, again closer now, though he could see nothing in the dark beyond. The reach of the light. He stepped out, the metal grate cold under his boots. The sea below was restless, waves breaking harder against the cliffs. Far out, something moved, something large, too large to be a boat, rolling just beneath the surface. He gripped the railing, watching as it passed. For a moment it broke the surface, and he saw something pale, a length of curved bone, maybe, or the edge of a massive shell before it slid under again. The beam swung past, and when it returned, the thing was gone. The wind carried a faint voice then, almost lost in the roar of the sea. It was calling his name. He staggered back inside, slamming the door. The lantern turned on steady, as though nothing had happened. But when he looked down the stairwell, water was seeping up each step, rising slowly, carrying with it strands. A black seaweed dot, he descended fast. The water was ankle-deep at the base, cold enough to make his bones ache. It was pouring in from the storage room, though the door there was shut. He waded toward it and pulled it open. The room was gone. Where it had been was now an open shaft, filled with dark, roiling water. It went down farther than the lantern's light could reach, and from somewhere in that depth the tapping came again. Something moved below something that caught the faint light and flashed it back like metal. Then, rising slowly, a shape appeared. The man in oilskins, holding the blue lantern, its cold flame unshaken by the water. He was standing on nothing, the water swirling around him, his face pale as bone. "The tide's inside now," he said. His voice echoed strangely, as though it came from far away and right beside the stranger at once. "And it knows your name." The lantern's blue light grew brighter, filling the room, washing over the stranger. The cold hit him harder than before, driving the air from his lungs. He stepped back, but his heel met only water-deep water. The floor was gone. The last thing he saw before the blue swallowed him was the brass key slipping from his hand, turning slowly as it fell into the dark below. Evelyn stood with her palm flat against the door, the grain rough beneath her glove, listening to the hush press in from the snow, listening to the tiny, irregular ticks of heat in the stovepipe, listening to the air itself, as if the lodge, old and wooden and patient, were deciding whether to keep her or let her go. She breathed slowly in through her nose, out through her mouth, counting the breaths, steadying her heart, steadying the tremor in her calves, steadying the wild, bright urgency that said, "Leave now, leave tonight, follow the trail back down the ridge and out across the flats while there is still light in the sky, while the aurora is thin and far, and you can pretend it is just weather." She took her hand from the door, turned back toward the table, toward the scattered papers, the brittle edges, the silver crescent, the name that tethered her to this place, the name carved in old wood beneath the firs, the name written in a hand that had never met her and never would, Nathaniel Calder, a marker that was not a grave, a warning that was not a riddle, a line drawn across decades and winter. She gathered the papers carefully, smoothing each page, tracing with a fingertip the places where ink had bled into fibers, where a word had been pressed more deeply than the rest, where urgency lived in pressure, not in letters, and she felt again that strange, quiet certainty that she had not come here by accident, that the pilot's call sign, the snowstorm's timing, the friendly clerk's folded map with its single penciled cross, all of it had been a soft hand at her back, guiding her toward a door she had not known she was already opening. She boiled water, poured it over tea leaves, watched the steam rise, watched it drift toward the window and vanish, as if the glass itself were drinking. She drank slowly, feeling the heat spread, feeling the steadiness return, and then she dressed again, layer upon layer, wool, canvas, down, the parka that smelled of cedar and old attics, the scarf that smelled of soap and faintly of city air, the boots that had carried her through airports and alleyways and now into a place where names froze into bark and lights moved without sound, and when she opened the door, the cold came in like a living thing, curious, not cruel, taking her measure, finding the seams, and she stepped out into it, stepped down into the snow, stepped toward the trees. The sky was a pale blue without warmth, the kind of light that felt like midnight masquerading as morning, the kind of light that made every shadow deliberate, the kind of light that asked, "Are you sure?" She was. She followed her own prints, already soft by a skiff of dry crystals, already less certain, and she thought, if I turn back now, the wind will erase this, and there will be no sign I ever walked this way, and perhaps that is the way of this place, to swallow and smooth, to keep its secrets not with malice, but with indifference, the way the sea keeps ships that go too deep. The marker waited where she had left it, tilted, patient, its letters shallow but insistent. N. Calder, 1934, and she knelt again, brushed away what the night had returned, found the scar her knife had left in the ice, found the dark oval. Where the tin had lain, found the thin thread of air that rose from the ground like breath from a hidden mouth. She lay her glove across the ice, felt nothing, but when she turned her cheek to it, the cold bit so sharply that her eyes watered, and in that sting she sensed a draught, not from above, not from wind, but from below, from within, and she understood, suddenly and completely, that the cairn was not a capstone in the way she had imagined, not a marker set atop solid earth, but a lid, a seal, a thin, old barrier for something that did not like being named. She sat back on her heels, listening, and in that near silence she heard something that was not the trees, not the distant glassy tinkle of ice on ice, but a rhythm she could not place, too slow for a heartbeat, too irregular for water, a pulse like a footstep dragged across stone. She stood and felt in the small of her back the weight of the crescent, the way it had felt warm when the light went dark outside her window, the way it sat like a second mouth against her spine, and she thought of her grandfather's note. Not the entries about fish and weather, but the jagged lines at the end, cairn underlined, not a grave, do not disturb, do not follow the lights, and she thought, are warnings only warnings, or are they maps? Maps of where danger is thickest, and therefore where truth is closest, and she did not want to disturb anything. She did not want to invite, to open, to unseal, but she also knew, down where fear and resolve share a border, that the only way out of some places is through. She marked the spot in her mind, the exact angle of the leaning trunk, the knot of roots like a hand, the pattern of dead grass frozen into curls. She photographed it with her eyes, and then with her phone, though the battery stumbled in the cold, and the screen dimmed, and then she turned back toward the lodge, not running, not hurrying, but not lingering either, walking the line between flight and approach, and when she reached the porch, she paused again, hand on the rail, and looked out across the open white, across the flats where snow became sky, and she had the peculiar sensation that someone had just stepped away from her shoulder, that if she turned quickly, she would catch a figure there, tall and narrow and not quite solid. And she did turn, and there was only the sagging wood pile, the old sled half buried, the antlers nailed above, the door bleached and pitted and delicate with age. Inside she warmed her hands, fed the stove, checked the generator, wrote a line in the journal, and then erased it, not wanting to put certain words into the air, not wanting to give them more shape than they already had, and as dusk came early, and quietly she set a pan of snow to melt, sorted the remaining food, counted cans without looking at the labels, counted matches without thinking of days. And when the aurora rose, she did not go to the window. She did not look. She kept her face toward the table and her hands busy with small tasks. And still the green found the edges of the room. Still the violet found the hinge of the door. Still the white, the too white, the not aurora, drifted at the corner of her sight and paused. And when it did, she reached back and touched the crescent and felt again a warmth that did not come from fire, a warmth like a name spoken by someone who has known you a very long time. The first knock came just before true night, not on the door, not on the glass, but on the outer wall, low down behind the chair, 3 slow taps, patient, patient, as if the thing that made them had time enough to try every plank, every nail. And she counted after they ended. She counted to 100, to 2, to 3, because sometimes silence has tides, sometimes what comes next arrives with the count. And when nothing came, she let her breath out slowly and closed her eyes and remembered the eyes at the tree line, too far apart, too steady, and she thought everything here watches, even the cold. Sleep came like a shallow river, thin and glassy, and she slid along it rather than into it, waking at each small shift of the building, at each sigh from the stove, at each distinct absence of sound. And in the longest of those absences she heard a voice, not outside, not in the room, but in the space behind her eyes, a voice that did not speak words so much as weights, that set heaviness down in different corners of her mind, and waited for her to feel them. And as she did, the weights arranged themselves, and the arrangement meant this: come, and then see, and then remember. And she opened her eyes to a darkness that felt attentive, and she knew she would not sleep again. In the morning, the lodge was rimed with frost from the inside, lace on the window panes, crystals on the nail heads, a feather of ice on the latch, and when she exhaled, the cloud of her breath hung longer than it should have, hung with the weight of air that had been breathed too many times by too few lungs, and she opened the door wide and let a new cold in, a fresher cold, a cold with edges, and the old cold retreated to the corners like a disappointed cat. The sky was low, clouds layered in sheets, pale within pale, and snow began again, fine and dry, a drift of glitter that made the world look slightly less certain. And she went back to the cairn with a coil of old rope and a pry bar she found. Behind the shed, its steel pitted, its handle smooth from the hands of men who had lifted engines and stoves and stones. At the cairn she listened first, because listening is a kind of test, and what you hear before you act is sometimes the only clear thing you get. And she heard the rhythm again, closer now, the dragged step, the granite scrape, and she set the pry bar's tip into the seam of ice where the tin had been, levered carefully, slowly, expecting nothing, asking nothing, promising nothing, and the ice responded like an old door, a pop, then a sigh, then a hairline darkening, and beneath that, darker, and beneath that, air. She brushed snow aside with her sleeve, worked the bar again, felt the weight shift beneath the surface, and then a thin, square edge revealed itself. Not wood, not tin, but iron, a hatch no larger than a breadboard, flush with the earth, held close by rust and time. She worked at it until her shoulders trembled, until her breath came ragged and sharp, until something inside the iron gave up a little of itself, and the lid shifted a finger's width, and out from that seam came a breath of air that smelled like old water and old stone and old rope, and within it, faint as if from a very long hallway, a bell. She froze, her hands on cold metal, and listened. The bell did not ring again, not with sound, but its aftertaste remained, copper and distance. And she thought of the buoy's voice far offshore, how it traveled through fog, how it told blind ships where the rocks were, and she thought, maybe, all bells are the same bell, maybe every warning is one voice. She pulled the hatch up, inch by inch, the iron screaming softly, and beneath it was a shaft lined in rocks dry and smooth, going down only as far as the light dared to follow, and at its edge old iron rungs set into stone, black with age, still sound. She tied the rope to a sturdy root, looped it through her belt, set her boot on the first rung, and descended, the cold changing as she went, becoming less sharp, more wet, the air thickening, the light thinning, and with each rung the sense grew in her that what she was entering was not a cellar, not a mine, not a place made to be used, but a place made to be endured. The shaft opened into a chamber, round and low, the ceiling close, the floor uneven with rock, and from somewhere to her right a narrow passage led deeper, not larger than a man's shoulders, rough with crystals that glinted even in the thin light that came from above. She took her headlamp from a pocket, tapped it against her palm until it steadied, and the passage showed itself in small details, scratch marks on stone, as if something large had been dragged through here, and had polished, by repetition, by patience, a path. She squeezed sideways, one shoulder forward, the other back, the pack scraping, the sound like paper tearing, and as she moved the crystals brushed her coat and whistled softly, the way glass sings when you wet your finger, run it along the rim. The passage opened into another chamber, taller, narrower, and in its center, set in ice so clear it seemed not to be there at all, was a post, a simple wooden post, its grain dark and tight, its top cut on a slant, and driven into that slanted top crooked was a nail black with age, and hanging from that nail by a frayed string was a small brass tag stamped with a number, not 1, Not 2, but 0, and her breath faltered, not because the number had meaning she could name, but because some part of her that had not been consulted recognized it. Around the base of the post in the ice were shapes like bubbles, like hands, like faces pressing gently upward, as if something beneath were trying to remember how to be above, and she could not tell if the shapes were moving or if it was only the strange way light moved in ice, sliding and returning, and she reached slowly toward the tag, not to take it, but to see if it would move, and from behind her, down the passage, a sound arrived, one she knew too well now, the slow scrape, the patient step, and then a breath that was not her breath, and she turned. In the doorway stood a figure so tall that to fit it had to fold its neck, so narrow that its coat hung on it like a memory, and in its hand was a lantern, not blue this time, not flame at all, but a sphere of white that shed no shadow, and the figure's face was a blur, not because of speed or distance, but because the parts of it refused to agree with one another, the eyes too far apart, the mouth almost where it should be, but not quite, and the impression was not of horror, but of error, as if someone had tried to draw a person from description and had almost succeeded. It lifted the lantern, and with that small motion, the temperature of the room dropped so suddenly that the light of her headlamp turned brittle and grainy, and she felt the crescent against her back grow warm, then warmer, then almost hot, and her bones recognized the heat as safety, the way you recognize the smell of your own house after years away. She did not speak, because speaking would be a way of agreeing that the rules above were the rules here, and she did not move, because moving would be a way of stating she had choices she did not have, and the figure waited, because waiting was what it was built of, and in the waiting she understood, not in words but in weight again, that the cairn was indeed not a grave, that the post was a pin, that the ice was thinner than it looked, that the number 0 was not a count, but a state, a circle that had not yet been broken, and that the thing before her did not want her to remove anything, did not want her to turn anything, did not want her to open or close, but wanted only this, that she know it knew she was here. She nodded once, slowly, because acknowledging a thing is sometimes a way of limiting it, and the lantern dimmed, and the figure stepped back, and in stepping back it lengthened, as if distance made it taller, and it withdrew into the passage, until the crystals held only her light again, and her breath and the soft complaint of rope on rock. She stood a long time with the post, with the tag, with the cold so deep it numbed her tongue, and she thought of the journal's last lines, of her grandfather's careful hand unraveling into haste, of the word cairn underlined thrice, of the instruction not to disturb, not to follow, and she thought, then what? Because if every rule is a wall, then inside the rules there must be a door, and perhaps the door is not made by hands, perhaps it is made by names. She took the papers from her inner pocket, unfolded one brittle page, the edges crackling, and she read Nathaniel Calder aloud, quietly, the way you say a prayer you are not sure you believe. And the room did not change. The ice did not crack. The lantern did not bloom back to life, but a tremor went through the post, a tremor so slight she would have missed it if her palm had not been resting against the wood, and under her hand she felt, just for a second, the pulse of sap, a tree, remembering itself. She whispered her own name then, first and last, not because she believed names had power and stories, but because here she had arrived at a place that did not care for belief, only for recursion, for things said and said again, and the crescent. Against her back warmed more, almost too much, and she stepped away, because warmth can be as dangerous as cold, and she backed through the passage, brushing crystals that sang, and she climbed the rungs, and she lowered the hatch, and she piled snow on it the way you bury a secret, not because it is evil, but because it is unready. At the lodge the wind had risen, a proper wind now, a wind that had purpose and noise, and the sky had come lower still, and the radio on the shelf, which had been nothing but static, caught a line of Morse, so clean she thought for a moment. It must be local, must be the pilot, but the rhythm was wrong, older, measured by hand, and she wrote as it came, letters spaced with care, and when she had the line it read, "Do not answer the tide," and then a second line, "When the lights move, stay in," and then a pause long enough to be a breath, and then in Calder, and her heart stumbled. Not with fear, but with that complicated feeling that arrives when time decides to be a circle for a while, and she tapped back, slow, unsure. Evelyn Calder received, and the silence after had a sound, the sound of relief learning how to be sound, and then nothing more. The storm came in earnest by mid-afternoon, horizontal snow, wind that made the trees hunch, a gray that made noon look like evening, and she checked the generator again, filled the tank to its mark, ran the line to the lodge's panel, turned things off that did not need to be on, lined up the candles on the table, counted them without saying the numbers, and ate carefully, not because she was starving, but because discipline is a kind of food when you are alone. As the light went from thin to thinner, the aurora tried to rise and the storm held it down, the sky flickering behind cloud like a heartbeat behind a wool coat, and the other lights, the two white, moved anyway, low among the trunks, threaded, in ways that suggested a path, suggested a sequence, suggested that if you followed now, now would turn into then, and then would turn into never. And she stood with her back not quite against the wall, with her shoulder not quite touching the window frame, with her hand not quite on the latch, and she let them be, and they went on without her, and when they realized she would not play, they went out like candles snuffed by a careful hand, and the dark that followed felt, briefly, like respect. Sleep that night was realer, heavier, made of hours instead of minutes, and she dreamed, not of the post or the tag, not of the figure with the almost face, but of the sea, which here was far, which here was only a rumor under ice and mountain, but which in her dream came right up to the porch, quiet and black and glassy, and there on it floated a small skiff. And in the skiff sat a man with his hands on the oars, but not rowing, his head turned not toward her, but toward the mountains, as if listening for a word they had not yet decided to say, and at his throat something silver. And when he turned at last, it was no one she knew, and it was every one she had ever loved. And she woke with her eyes wet, and the taste of salt, not from tears. The storm cleared before dawn, swept east, leaving a sky scrubbed and brittle, stars hard and near, and between them the thin, pale arc of a moon that looked like the crescent she wore. And she thought, this is why people used to think things were connected, because sometimes they are. She packed a bag before the light came, not because she meant to leave, but because preparedness is a spell. Extra socks, extra gloves, the little Sawyer filter, a sleeve of crackers, dried apples, the last of the jerky, a new set of batteries, a pencil and a wrapped stub of candle, and she set the bag by the door and stood a long time with her hand on the strap and did not take it, because the day did not feel like an errand day. It felt like a vigil. The prince returned before noon, not one set now, but three, circling, overlapping, sometimes intersecting and then diverging again, long, narrow, with a little tail where the weight dragged. And she followed them with her eyes only, not her feet, and as she watched, as the sun scrolled slowly behind thin cloud, something new arrived at the edge of her hearing, the sound of a bell again, faint, regular, distant, but inside, and she felt it in the boards under her boots, felt it in the enamel of her teeth, felt it in the crescent warming, and she understood that the pin in the ice had not loosened, but had been tested, the way a door is tested at night by a hand that does not knock. Evening came with a clear sky, and at last the aurora rose unhindered, green first, then a wash of violet like breath on glass, and the white came with it, but more now of braiding thin filaments that wound through the spruce like thread through cloth, and this time they did not come to the window. This time they went toward the cairn, and she felt something that surprised her. Not fear, not dread, but anger, an anger as clean as ice, as neat as a cut, because the lights had learned her, had mapped her habits, had taken her measure, and they had decided she would follow. And she did not like being written so easily, so she let the stove die to coals. She put on her parka. She took her rifle, not for shooting, but for steadiness, for balance. She tucked the crescent inside the first layer where her body could keep it warm. She opened the door, and the cold took her cheeks in both hands and kissed them hard. And she stepped into the night. The snow squeaked underfoot, dry and sharp, and each breath came small and efficient, and the sky above her was a river lit from within, and the trees were dark book spines in a library without walls, and she walked the way you walk in a church. When you are alone, not quiet because anyone asked it of you, but because your own footsteps ask it of themselves. At the cairn, the lights had arranged themselves into a circle, low, close to the ground, with one bright thread leading toward the hatch like a fuse, and where they touched the snow, The crystals looked wet, and she thought, if I put my hand into that, will it pass through? And she did not try. She cleared the hatch with the edge of her boot, brushed it with her glove, lifted, and the iron came easier now, as if something below had reached up to help, and the breath of old air that came out made the white lights shiver in a way the Aurora did not, and she said aloud, because sometimes saying a thing is also a way of writing lines, I am not here to let you out. And the lights stilled, and she began to descend. The passage seemed narrower in the night, the crystals song higher, the sense of being watched so particular. She could have pointed to the stones that were doing it, and in the chamber the post waited, unchanged, the tag a little crooked because of some drift of air, and this time she did not go to it, not at first. This time she turned her lamp slowly around the walls, and the walls were not only walls. The walls were a palimpsest of names scored lightly into the softer veins of rock, name after name after name, some clear, some half-worn, some at angles, some in a hand like a careful child's, and among them a cluster, Calder, written 4 times, each with an initial unreadable, except for one. In and under that a small mark, a crescent drawn in 2 strokes, and next to it a line that wasn't a name at all but a word, hold, and beneath that a year, 1934. She stood very still. A phrase from her grandfather's journal rose in her mind, not one she had noticed before, a nothing line, a between-weather note line, the kind that looks like padding until the light hits it at the right slant. Went down today, it had said, held an hour, and below it a small symbol she had not thought about, a quarter circle. She ran her glove over the word hold and felt the grooves, thin and shallow, and realized the post was not only a pin in the ice, it was a relay that needed to be held, not turned, not removed, but pressed, a human hand to finish a circuit that could not complete itself. And suddenly she understood why a family would keep a lodge in a place like this for generations. Why a man would write about fish as a cover for what he was actually catching. Why a note would say, do not disturb. Do not follow, because the work was not to go, the work was to stay. And staying is work that looks like nothing until you stop doing it. She went to the post, then set her palm against the slanted cut, and the cold was so bright and so clean that hers and the wood's canceled one another, and somewhere beneath, deep enough that the sense of direction bent, something heavy leaned back into place with a sound too low to hear, but not too low to feel. And the white lights at the hatch above, the ones that had followed and coaxed and taught their lesson, dimmed, drew in, unwound, and the chamber exhaled, and at the edge of her hearing the bell, which had been ringing all along in negative, stopped. She stood until her shoulders shook, until her elbow locked, and then unlocked, until her hand stopped being a hand and became only a symbol for pressure, and when she let go at last, the post remained steady, the tag did not turn, the face was in. The ice did not rise, and she laughed a little, a single small sound that bounced off stone, and came back less sure of itself, and she said softly into her scarf, "You can come back if you want, Granddad. I can hold a while," and the lamp faltered. And for a heartbeat she thought the figure with the lantern had returned. But it was only her breath making shapes against the beam, only her breath, and she climbed, rung by rung, feeling each one like a rung on a story that had been told too, many times to a child who did not believe, and then grew up and found the place in the wall that opened when you pressed. At the top, the sky had changed again. The river above her slowed, the colors thin and far, as if the world had sighed out, and the lights in the trees were gone, taken up or gone out, and the snow had settled in a faint skin on the hatch, and made it look as if it had always been closed, and she shut it, and she covered it, and she pressed her palm into the snow and left the print there like a small vow. Back at the lodge, the generator hummed as if it had just been tuned. The stove drew cleanly, the radio sat dumb and innocent, and the sense of being accompanied eased, not vanished, no, but eased, like a headache that has decided to become a memory. She boiled tea again, poured it, added honey she had been saving for a hard day, and she sat with the mug in her hands and the journal open and wrote a line not about weather, but about work. She wrote, held, and she drew a small crescent, and she underlined nothing, because underlining is for warnings, and this was not a warning. This was a routine, and she found in herself a steadiness that she had not felt since she arrived, a steadiness that felt less like courage and more like belonging. And she went to the door and opened it and let the cold put its head in and look around. And she said into the blue air, "I know you." And the air said nothing, which was answer enough. She slept, finally, the deep kind, the kind without pictures, the kind you wake from without a seam. And in the morning, the world was the kind of bright that hurts. The snow a field of knives, the sky so clear you could see the distinctions between distances and far off, farther than the pilot's path, farther than the river, farther than the minds of men who build maps. A thin white line stood on the horizon like the edge of a page, and she thought, perhaps that's where the story ends. And then, because good days do not last here, the generator coughed, sputtered, hesitated, coughed again, died. She rewired the panel by habit, checked the fuel, checked the plug, checked the intake, felt the dread arrive like a neighbor you do not dislike but cannot entertain, and she knew what needed doing. The line had iced, the intake had drifted. The thing needed hands, and so did she, and in that small mirroring lay the comfort. So she dressed, and she stepped out, and she dug, and she banged the line with her glove until the ice inside broke in a neat cylinder and slid out like a clear snake, and she cleared the exhaust, and she brushed the vents, and the sky went thin at the edges and then darkened with a fast, mean squall, and she was halfway to the door when the white lights returned not from the trees, but from under the porch. It bloomed like dandelion seeds in reverse, and she steadied herself against the jamb and said softly, "Not now, not now," and they hesitated, as if considering, and then some impulse among them won, and they moved toward her, and the crescent at. Her back flared so hot she cried out, not in pain but in shock, and the lights withdrew at once, and in their withdrawal she felt something she had not expected. She felt apology, and she almost laughed again, because in a world where apology exists, even in white lights, even in ice, then perhaps staying is always the right work. She started the generator, and it came back clean, and the lights in the lodge steadied, and the day went on in its narrow winter way, slicing itself into usable slivers, and she used them, writing, mending a glove, sharpening the knife that had opened the tin, counting the candles again just to have the numbers turn into a lullaby in her head. And when evening came, she stood at the window this time and watched, and let the aurora be itself, and let the other lights, wherever they had gone, be themselves. And for the first time since she arrived, the night felt like night and not like a question. The next 2 days were ordinary, which in a place like this means only 3 small alarms. A fox that watched her a long time and then lost interest. A crack in the ice on the north side of the well that sounded like a rifle shot and sent her to ground with her heart in her throat. A cloud that looked like a hand and then like a ship and then like a nothing. And in the journal she wrote lines her grandfather would recognize. Snow 2 inches, wind NNE 10, aurora faint, saw 3 ravens, and in the margins she wrote a thing. He would not post steady, lantern absent, held twice, and she felt the shape of a rhythm forming, not in the sky, not in the snow, but in her. And she understood that the stories people tell about haunted places are not wrong, but are perhaps incomplete. That between the big moments, between the arrivals and the breakings and the nights when lights drift like bait, there is the work, the small, unphotographable work. And that work is what holds the world together and keeps the number on the tag from becoming a 1. On the 4th morning, a distant engine stitched the air, a prop sound, a civilized sound, and she stepped outside and shaded her eyes, and the pilot's plane circled once, wagged, set down on the flat like a needle landing on cloth, and he climbed out and waved, and then stopped waving, because something in her posture told him not to, and when he came closer he looked past her at the lodge, and past the lodge at the trees, and then at the horizon, and said, in a voice that did not belong to a man who laughs at weather, "Do you want to go?" And she surprised herself by saying, "Not yet." And he surprised himself by nodding, as if that were what he had expected. And he said, "I brought mail," and she said, "I wrote none," and he handed her a brown envelope anyway, and inside was a single sheet torn from a ledger old, with a watermark, and on it a hand that was not her grandfather's and not hers had written, simply "Hold," and she folded it, and she put it with the journal, and she made coffee for the pilot, and when he asked if the stories were true, she said, "Which ones?" And he laughed the way you laugh when you want to stop, and he said, "Do you have enough fuel?" And she said, "For now," and he left, because leaving is the work of his kind, and staying is the work of hers. That night the almost face came to the edge of the clearing, not to the window, not to the door, but to the line where the flattened snow met the soft piles against the spruce, and it stood there a long time, long enough for the stars to move, long enough for the aurora to fade and come again, and it held the lantern that was not a lantern, and it did not lift it, and it did not try to speak weights into her bones, and it waited only until she stepped to the threshold and said, softly enough that her words could have been only breath, I know, and the lantern dimmed, and the figure lengthened, and the clearing became only a clearing again. In the morning she wrote nothing, because sometimes the right record is silence, and she went to the cairn and she did not open it, because sometimes the right door is the closed one, and she put her hand on the snow where the hatches seem, lay and felt nothing, which was the best thing to feel, and she walked back through a world that for the first time since she arrived felt equal to her, not taller, not older, not angrier, just itself, and being itself is the hardest work of all. The night was heavy, soaked in the damp fragrance of moss and mud, as if the entire Louisiana bayou had exhaled and refused to inhale again. A faint mist hung low over the stagnant waters, curling around the cypress knees and the leaning wooden pier that jutted into the black current. Against this hush the old house stood silent, its shutters crooked, its roof sagging as though weighed down by memories too heavy to bear, and within a single lamp glowed like the last heartbeat of a fading dream, painting shadows along warped walls and creaking floorboards. Eleanor moved slowly through the hall, her hand brushing against peeling wallpaper that once held patterns of magnolia blossoms, now lost beneath water stains. She listened not for the familiar groans of the house, but for the murmur that had haunted her these many nights, a voice that seemed neither inside nor outside, neither real nor imagined, yet always calling. It threaded through the stillness, low and plaintive, like a hymn carried across the marsh dot. She paused by the parlor door, where the curtains swayed though no breeze touched them, and for a long moment she hesitated. The fire had long died in the grate, but she could still smell wood smoke, faint but persistent, as if the memory of warmth clung stubbornly to the air. She whispered, "Is it you?" Not daring to speak louder, not daring to admit she expected an answer. The reply came not in words, but in the shifting of light. The lamplight flickered though her hand was steady, and shadows rippled across the far wall like figures dancing just beyond recognition. A chill traced her spine. She stepped inside. The bayou house had always been a gathering place, once alive with laughter, music, the roll of dice, and the stomp of boots after a long day on the water. Her grandfather built it with pride. Her mother had sung in its kitchen. Her father had told stories by its hearth. But time had stripped away its joy, and storms had battered its frame, until only she remained, the last heir to its memories, the last witness to its whispers. And now the house seemed intent on unburdening itself, pouring out secrets buried in its bones. She walked to the far corner where a trunk rested beneath the window, its brass latches dulled with age. The voice grew clearer as she neared, rising from a hum to a soft chant, not quite words, yet shaping meaning in the rhythm of syllables. Her fingers trembled as she touched the lid, and when she opened it, the air shifted, a warm draught brushing her cheek, though the mist outside pressed cold against the glass. Inside lay letters bound in twine, brittle photographs, and a small wooden box carved with river reeds. She lifted the box carefully, her heart thundering. The carvings were rough but deliberate, the kind of craft done not for beauty but for memory. She opened it, and inside, beneath a square of faded cloth, was a locket. It was simple brass, worn, smooth by years of touch, but when she pried it open, she found a miniature painting, a woman's face, serene yet sorrowful, eyes painted in strokes of blue that seemed impossibly vivid. The moment her gaze met those eyes, the voice in the room became clear, sharp as a bell through fog. "Do you remember?" it asked. Eleanor staggered, clutching the locket to her chest. She wanted to answer, to cry out that she did not, that she could not, that the face meant nothing to her. But tears blurred her vision, and a memory stirred, not her own, but something older, something pressed into her blood like a song sung across generations. A woman standing at the edge of the bayou, her skirt soaked, her eyes fixed on the horizon as if waiting for someone who never returned. The room darkened, the lamp sputtering as if drowned by unseen water, and the mist outside pressed against the glass until it seeped through the cracks, curling along the floorboards. The parlor filled with a damp chill, and through it stepped the figure Eleanor had both dreaded and yearned to see. She was tall, her outline wavering like smoke, her dress of another century, her hair braided in a style long out of fashion. Yet her eyes, the same painted blue as the locket, were piercing, alive, filled with both longing and sorrow. She looked at Eleanor not as a stranger, but as kin, as if the blood between them recognized itself. "You kept the house," the figure whispered. "You kept the silence." Eleanor's throat ached as she forced herself to speak. "Who are you?" The woman's smile was faint, a crescent of regret. "I am what was left behind. I am the promise unfulfilled. And you, child, are the last to carry it." The room seemed to breathe with them, every beam and board leaning closer, listening. Eleanor clutched the locket tighter, as though it were an anchor against the pull of this presence. "What promise?" she asked. The woman's form wavered, her gaze drifting to the window, where the bayou stretched in eternal darkness. To wait, to remember, to keep the song alive. Outside a loon cried, its voice sharp and mournful across the water, and the sound threaded into the figure's words until it was impossible to tell whether the bird sang or the spirit spoke. Eleanor shook her head, tears streaking her cheeks. "I can't keep waiting. I can't keep carrying what I don't understand." The figure stepped closer, and though her body seemed made of mist, her hand was warm as it brushed Eleanor's cheek. Then let me carry you instead." The house groaned, the floor shuddered, and for a breathless moment Eleanor felt herself dissolving, her heartbeat slowing to match the rhythm of the bayou, her breath entwined with the mist, her thoughts drawn into the echo of that endless waiting. But she clung to the locket, pressed it hard against her palm until the edge cut skin, grounding her in pain. "No," she whispered fiercely, "not yet." The figure's smile softened, and her form flickered like a candle nearing its end. "Then remember me," she said. "That will be enough." And with that, the mist withdrew, sliding back through the cracks, curling out toward the water, until only silence remained. The lamp steadied, its glow warm once more, and Eleanor found herself alone in the parlor, clutching the locket with blood seeping from her palm. She sank to the floor, trembling, staring at the box and letters still in the trunk. She knew now that the house was not simply walls and wood, but memory itself, holding what the living had forgotten, waiting for someone to listen. And though the spirit had faded, her words lingered like smoke. "Remember me." The bayou outside lapped softly against the pier, and the loon's cry echoed once more, distant yet eternal. Eleanor closed her eyes, and for the first time the silence felt like an embrace rather than a burden.